This is our program for the week of June 9th, 2025. I want to bring up my comrade Samer. Samer, welcome back. What else is new? We have a lot to cover today. Over the last 48 hours, we've seen multiple attacks against Iran by the Israeli military. We're seeing reports that Iran has struck back at Tel Aviv just moments ago. And the initial attacks by Israel are against Iran's nuclear program, and that again has put us back into this unstable territory regarding the possible eruption of a larger regional war between states with nuclear capabilities. And for the nuclear arms watchdogs, this is coming off the heels of tensions between Pakistan and India escalating just a few weeks ago. And at a time when the U.S. administration has become an even less reliable or predictable actor in global politics. And we're also in the midst, as you and I have been talking about, and as you've been helping to analyze and report over the last couple months and weeks, just this continued onslaught against Palestinians in Gaza, the complete failure, as the UN put it just yesterday or today, and the predictable failure of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, backed by the US and Israel, the capturing and release of hostages from the Gaza flotilla, and many, many, many other updates from the Middle East that bear on the question of how to stop the genocide in Gaza. Of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't also mention that this is all happening while the National Guard and US Marines have been deployed to California to set up this unprecedented standoff among political leadership in the US against a dictator-in-chief who is attempting to host a military parade to celebrate his birthday, of all meaningless things. So, how many ways can we say that these are absolutely unprecedented times? But before we get into it, Samra, I did want to just take a moment to share a brief clip that provides just a little bit of recent historical context and situates us in the position we were only a few months ago. And as predicted on this program, that as time marched on, we'd see more and more Biden officials involved in supporting or justifying the genocide in Gaza, that they would start to have belated epiphanies about what was happening then in the throes of Israel's litany of war crimes. But let's have a listen about one such notorious Biden official.
I wanted to ask you about a former colleague of yours, former State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller under President Biden, who recently made headlines when he admitted Israel had committed war crimes in Gaza, something he never said from the State Department podium.
I don't think it's a genocide, but I think I think it is without a doubt true that Israel has committed war crimes.
You wouldn't have said that at the podium.
Yeah, look, because when you're at the podium, you're not expressing your personal opinion. You're expressing the conclusions of the United States government.
So I'm wondering if you can respond to what the former State Department spokesperson under Biden, Matt Miller, is saying on Sky News. Did it surprise you, Hala?
I can absolutely respond, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. It is absolutely disgusting. That's it. I'm going to be very blunt, Amy, because I worked in the exact same office as Matthew Miller. The reports that I mentioned that I wrote on a daily basis when I was a spokesperson, they went up that chain. They went up to Global Public Affairs. I knew he knew because I was drafting reports showing the war crimes. When I was asked to spread those lies, I said I cannot spread lies. I swore an oath to the U.S. Constitution when I became a diplomat. I had a top secret security clearance. That means we don't violate laws. We don't violate U.S. laws. We don't violate international laws. And if you are a true patriot, if you are truly a diplomat, you do not do as you are told when you know it is illegal. You do not do as you're told when you know it is immoral, when it is inhumane. And fundamentally as well, when you know it is a threat to U.S. national security, which we all knew, which I was also documenting. As far as I'm concerned, Matthew Miller has blood on his hands because he knew what he was doing was wrong. And why was he doing it? For careerism. I'm going to be very blunt, Amy, because perhaps I'm not as diplomatic as I should be or as I used to be. But but it's careerism. And the only reason why he admitted it now, again, on TV, is because he thinks it's going to make him look good, where in reality, it makes him look terrible because everybody knew he was lying. But that does not make a good diplomat, certainly not. And fundamentally, I think it's going to haunt him for the rest of his life, whereas I have a very clean conscience and I'll continue to try to do good in the world. It's not about a paycheck. It's about the type of world we live in and we want our children to grow up in.
Samurai, no notes on Hala's rant there. Maybe
No
other than to
notes.
say, yeah, other than to say that maybe she might miss the mark on whether or not his conscience will bother him at some point. That's yet to be seen. But yeah, I mean, we talked about this. It's predictable and it's sad, but it is happening in fits and starts already that the Biden officials are coming out, and I think that is in some ways a telling sign, a positive sign in some ways that facade has limited value, but nonetheless, infuriating, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's so infuriating. And Count Smirkula is not the only one, right? What's her name? Karine Jean-Pierre also now, suddenly wants to do a tell-all memoir about how dysfunctional the Biden White House was. Like, it's so utterly predictable to see these people responding in this way. And I think while it's frustrating and disgusting, I think it's also important to like situate it in this evolving political context, right? Like we are in a moment where
Mhm.
contradictions are being sharpened, and that's important to remember, right? Like folks are realizing that, when the opportunists realize that their own political careers depend on them actually saying that there were war crimes, that actually means something, and I think that's not nothing. I don't know if folks saw Scott Wiener yesterday was tweeting about anti-Palestinian racism, like,
Yeah.
in the most guy in a hot dog suit saying we all are trying to figure out who did this kind of thing. Like, just the fact that we're at that moment, I think, really is quite telling, and I think really speaks to how we need to, we talked about this in the last PSA too, right? Like, how we need to capitalize on that in a way that actually forces people to sort of put out where they actually stand.
Yeah, I mean, Scott Wiener's quotable quotes since in the last few months are remarkable given what he said
Incredible.
all of last year. And yeah, I'm sure that there's a Wikipedia page for Matt Miller that really deserves the inclusion of Smirkula, Count Smirkula, as one of his alter egos. But we have a lot to cover. Again, great to have you back. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Thomas. Always good to be here. It's been a week. It's really, I know I always say that, but somehow things keep accelerating. And this week, I don't think anyone can call this anything but a really serious acceleration. Um, so we can jump right in if are the are slides being shared, Thomas?
They're not showing up on my end. Let's just see if I'm gonna see if we can.
Hey, no.
Yeah, let's see. I don't think. Can you try sharing them again?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Again, as Samara mentioned, we're a little bit skeleton crew these days. There
We're
we go.
making it work.
Okay, there you go.
Oh, oh. Full skeleton crew. Sorry, one second, one second. That time it was my fault. Mm-mm-mm. There we go.
Okay, great.
All right. So, yeah, jumping right in. It has, of course, been a really heavy week in Gaza, per usual. It's sort of been, of course, eclipsed by a lot of other news, as happens sometimes, but the official death toll has gone up by another 600 since last Friday. We're seeing, more or less daily aid massacres happening, and we'll get into, of course, all the dynamics that are happening with this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. But just to know, in addition to, of course, the humanitarian catastrophe, in addition to the ongoing onslaught from this Gideon's Chariots campaign, Gaza is now, as of this week, also subject to a total telecommunications blackout. There is no internet. There's effectively almost no mobile network. Um, and like whatever chains of communication are totally disrupted, like telephone lines being ripped out and things. So obviously this seems to be a deliberate escalation in terms of, what Israel often does right before committing the worst of its massacres. So the fact that the internet has once again been cut off, I think should be a really worrying sign for folks about what's coming down the pipe this coming weekend. As you can imagine, given what happened this past week, I think we're in for quite a week for what comes down in the next few days. But sticking with Gaza for a little bit, just to start with what's been happening with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Um, Firstly, the extent to which the GHF project has been an unmitigated disaster, I think is surprising even to me as someone who has called it something that was likely to be a total disaster for well over a month now, to the point where not only, last week we talked about how Boston Consulting Group, who was supposed to be responsible for the logistics of the GHF, pulled out of the project. They've now fired the partners that were involved in the project and are launching a formal investigation into how they were ever like contracted to do this project in the first place. That's the extent to which this has become an unmitigated embarrassment. Um, and this CCR article from this week, I think, does a wonderful job of I guess more of a press release than an article, like getting into the ways in which the actions of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation are themselves complicity in the genocide, right? That there is liability here for creating a system that is itself fostering forced displacement and the killing of civilians in ways that, we've gotten into in past PSAs, and I'd encourage folks to check those out if you don't know the details of why the structure of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is basically perfectly designed to facilitate ethnic cleansing and murder. And that basically has largely been what it has accomplished, right? And we're in a situation where we really can't trust anything that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is saying or doing. And there's a lot of opacity around what they've even been purportedly distributing, but also their underlying funding. And we'll get into the various pieces of this today. But one thing of note, this week that I thought was interesting was some competing narratives happening around what the GHF is saying around its so-called Palestinian workers, who they're claiming have been shot by Hamas, not Hamas militants, incidentally, but the police force of Gaza, which currently exists largely to make sure that aid isn't being looted. Um, the police force is claiming that this new Abu Shabab militia, the group that the so-called ISIS-like group that Israel has been confirmed to be arming and funding, were trying to loot these aid caravans and they were shot. It would not be surprising if that militia group is in fact coordinating with the GHF. In fact, I would almost guarantee it because for them to operate inside the Gaza Strip, they have to coordinate with armed groups in terms of how they set up their local areas. And it would not be surprising to me if they were coordinating with the armed group that Israel is trying to set up as a counterweight to Hamas. Incidentally, this group, Abu Shabab, is now listed on Wikipedia as one of the belligerents of the war on the side of Israel, obviously. So there's some really interesting dynamics going on here. There's actually a lot of detail about all of this in this Times of Israel article, so I would definitely recommend folks give it a read. But um, there's also, yeah, there's summaries here in case you don't want to open Israeli media. Uh, it's also worth noting that, this week the GHF claimed just yesterday that it had distributed like its day's worth of aid in an area where the Israeli forces had declared a no-go zone. So at 3 a.m., the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation said, "Okay, we finished distributing our aid today in an area where it was prohibited for Palestinians to even approach until 3 hours after that, until 6 a.m." So like just blatantly lying, right, about the fact that they're doing distributions that in fact are not occurring at all. Um, and it's worth noting, from what we've heard in terms of what has been included in the distributions that the GHF has actually done is a series of food supplies that are, for all intents and purposes, unusable by Palestinians. So they include things, for example, like raw pasta, which, with Israel completely blocking the entry of any sort of cooking gas or electricity, it's inconceivable for people to be able to cook the raw pasta. So it's basically useless. So even when they do distribute things, like it's either purposely designed or incompetently designed, and this is, the age-old PSA question: Are they evil or are they stupid? To be effectively unusable for the people that they're distributing this stuff to. And in the midst of this, in the midst of everybody backing away from the GHF and realizing what, an embarrassment and what a disaster it has been, we're also seeing the State Department talking about giving $500 million to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And this is, still somewhat in the realm of hearsay. Nothing about this has been confirmed yet, but if that happens, obviously that's the largest cash infusion to that institution by far, although we don't know. We actually don't know anything about who is funding the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and how it operates. They're actually refusing to disclose their donors. There were a couple of leaks in Israeli media saying that the Israeli the defense ministry, had given them $100 million, which, by the way, is the operating budget for 1 month of the GHF. And there seem to be also rumors that Gulf states are also providing money, but that the Gulf states don't want it to be known that they're providing money. There was some like Israeli media about this that then got blacked out the next day, so that seems like it is very likely the case. But just to say, there seems to be a strong interest within the U.S. government to prop up this clearly failing and clearly inappropriate institution. Although, if its goal is in fact to facilitate the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, then it's not failing, right? It's doing the thing that it was maybe actually designed to do, which is force all Palestinians into an ever smaller area where they can be forcibly displaced. Outside of the GHF stuff, I did want to note that um, given the pressure that has been happening and given the high profile nature of the failure of the GHF, including, like articles like this in the New York Times about, the extent of the starvation that is now besetting the Gaza Strip. Um, for the first time yesterday, aid trucks were once again allowed back into Gaza, coordinated through actual aid delivery. So, like through the World Food Program, and I think the World Central Kitchen were both distributing. I think 100 trucks or so came through, and that's a direct consequence, I think, of international pressure and like the high profile failure of the GHF. So just to say that kind of speaking up about it and pointing out those failures actually does have really material impacts here. Moving out of aid into like the broader military campaign, you know, Gideon's Chariots continues apace, on somewhat on track for its time schedule of occupying 3/4 of the Gaza Strip within 2 months. It continues to largely be an operational failure, even if it is sort of like tactically moving forward. Again, a sort of long-running strategic orientation of the PSA is that the Israeli military is really, really effective at killing people, but a terrible, terrible governing force, right? It does not know how to occupy and control the land that it is taking, and it continues to suffer pretty heavy military losses as a consequence. I thought this, like response from Hamas saying that they're going to continue to hurl David stones at Gideon's chariots was I think encapsulates well basically the situation that they're in, where it's impossible for them not to suffer pretty severe military casualties in a way that I think is really sapping public support for this campaign in ways that we'll come back around to. But it's hard to see Gideon's Chariots as anything but a large-scale strategic failure. And I think this article and memo does a pretty good job of showing how the underlying assumptions of this campaign are the same unchanged assumptions that Israel has operated under for, the past however many decades, the same underlying assumptions that the United States used in its occupation of Iraq, right? Basically, this idea that overwhelming military force can eliminate, like locally based military resistance movements, and just like that just never works. And it clearly hasn't been working for the past year and a half, and there's no reason to think that it's suddenly about to work. And particularly given, as we've seen for the past year and a half in Gaza, and as we saw with the US in Iraq and Afghanistan and wherever else, there's also no coherent or executable exit strategy. So we continue to see like the sort of flailing campaign that is, costing an unimaginable number of human lives and untold devastation, but isn't actually achieving any of the underlying strategic objectives that it's meant to achieve beyond widespread destruction. So, it's not really clear where this can go and how long popular will be able to sustain it. So, I would encourage people to consider the fact that as horrific as Gideon's Chariots is, it's weaker than it seems. And I think it's much more fragile and brittle than it appears to be because you see this military juggernaut that seems unstoppable. But the attrition of that juggernaut, I think, is the thing that sort of like brings it down over time. In terms of the, sorry, I, I was putting these slides together at the airport yesterday while we were occupying SFO for the Palestinians who were detained, and I completely forgot that I put a clown hat on Donald Trump because I am so tired of pulling up articles with his face on them. But sorry. Anyway, so just to say, in terms of what's been happening with the ceasefire, there's very little to report, frankly. Um, that there's this idea that Israel is preparing a counter offer basically on the current stalled ceasefire negotiations. And there seems to be, the sort of back and forth that's happening right now about how long the timeline for the temporary cessation of hostilities will be, what the time frame is for the exchange of political prisoners. And all of that, is meaningful, but at the end of the day, Israel is basically uh, has said explicitly and repeatedly that they won't agree to any agreement that includes a permanent end to the war, and they won't agree to anything that limits their future military presence in Gaza and anything that limits their control and distribution of humanitarian aid. And those three things are red lines for Hamas. So, like, these ceasefire negotiations aren't really going anywhere. The only really, I think, interesting development that happened this week is just Trump saying that Iran has been involved in the ceasefire negotiations, and he like sort of offhandedly said it and then refused to just elaborate on it. So this might just be a gaffe, and he might be inadvertently revealing something about the underlying ceasefire dynamics that we're not privy to. But obviously, I mean, I'm sure they've been involved in some capacity, but if they're like directly involved in the negotiations, that tells us some really fascinating things about the dynamics that led to the strikes on Iran yesterday. So that's definitely worth diving into. And I think more about that will probably be clear in the coming week or so. Moving over to the West Bank, a few different things here. Obviously the increasing and ongoing settler violence is a really horrifying development. The continued retribution on people who were involved in the Louis Theroux documentary on Israeli settlers continue to be attacked, and like are being like hospitalized and brutalized by settlers pretty repeatedly. But probably the big news of the week in the West Bank is this long coming, and it's something that we actually talked about months ago on the PSA that this was likely coming, that the land registration process in the West Bank has now officially changed. And it's a little bit esoteric here, but broadly, what this means is that any land ownership title that came from either, like obviously, historical mandate Palestine, but the Jordanian government when Jordan occupied the West Bank from 1948 to 67, or any land titles that have been provided by the Palestinian Authority in Gaza are now all null and void. So they don't mean anything at all. So if you have a land title based on some sort of Palestinian, governance process, the Israeli government doesn't recognize that, and all land title ownership now has to be done directly through the Israeli state. And more importantly, and actually more worryingly, um, the process of land registration is moving from a military process, given that the West Bank is under military occupation, to a civil administration process, which is like part of the long ongoing annexation of the West Bank, but also means that land ownership title in now an additional 60% of the West Bank is open to private Israeli citizens. So when Israeli settlers want, they can apply for land titling for basically anywhere, not anywhere, but for most of the West Bank. And now private actors, like this doesn't have to run through the military, just anybody any Israeli obviously can buy land in the West Bank and steal it. Again, this is really obviously it's impossible to see this as anything other than the de facto continuation of the annexation process, right? To like move the West Bank from being the sort of like special militarized area into the sort of, just part of annexed Israel. At the same time, dear ambassador to Israel from the United States, Mike Huckabee, um, is on record now as saying that the United States no longer supports the idea of a Palestinian state at all as a policy goal. So like the United States now is backing away from the idea of a two-state solution, saying that the Palestinian state, if it were to ever be established, could be established somewhere else, like maybe in Saudi Arabia, but there isn't really much of an interest in having a Palestinian state at all. So unwelcome, but perhaps unsurprising development on that front. Um, Moving to Europe, in additional bad news, last week we spent a lot of time talking about. This is the first time I think I've referenced myself in the PSAs, but I'm clearly losing my mind. I apologize for this, but uh, last week we talked a lot about how Europe was doing a lot of posturing about the recognition of a Palestinian state and about a changing relationship with Israel, and we talked quite a bit about how we shouldn't hold our breath and we shouldn't be expect much from Europe in terms of actual material consequences for the facilitation of Israel's genocide. And sure enough, this week, the United Kingdom and France have completely backtracked on their promise to recognize a Palestinian state and have basically done a complete 180. And basically, their way of wiggling out of the statements that they had made about recognizing a Palestinian state is that they're now situating it within like, oh, a peace process. And, we would recognize a Palestinian state maybe after the Arab countries and Saudi Arabia in particular all normalize their relations with Israel. So they've gone from we need to recognize a Palestinian state to whoop, the other way around, everyone else needs to recognize an Israeli state. So a total failure, right? And then like a complete caving into what must be primarily U.S. pressure for them to sort of cave on those demands. But again, if you watch last week's PSA, we talked specifically about how the material conditions were not changing at all, that the discursive shift shouldn't be seen as an indication that the material reality was going to change. And sure enough, here we are. Now the discursive shift was the thing that changed. Um, Moving on to Yemen, where this didn't really get a lot of play, but there has also been a serious military escalation in Yemen this week, where for the first time, the Israeli Navy is now involved in attacks on Yemeni soil. They bombed the port of Hodeidah again, but this time from the Navy. And of course, in response, more missiles have been launched from the Houthi-controlled area of Yemen into Israel. Those missiles are, quote, most likely intercepted, which I don't even know what that means. Like they either hit or they didn't hit, but apparently nobody knows whether the Yemeni missiles hit Israel or not. In Lebanon, the Israelis are warning that they will continue to bomb Lebanon in continued violation of the ceasefire that was signed between Israel and Hezbollah if Lebanon doesn't do more to disarm Hezbollah, which, as we've talked about in past episodes, the state doesn't really have the capability to do that anyway. So this just seems like more justification for continued assaults on Lebanese sovereignty and Lebanese territory. And at the same time, this lovely Jerusalem Post article gets into the ways in which the US and Israel are now basically trying to disband the United Nations interim force in Lebanon. So like the UN peacekeepers that were there to enforce the demilitarized area between Lebanon and Israel, like the U.S. and Israel are trying to get rid of them, obviously, so that Israel can continue to occupy Lebanon with impunity. We saw that attacks that Israel committed against UNIFIL forces and the really brave stance, frankly, that a lot of UNIFIL forces took in refusing to leave their posts under threat of Israeli bombardment. And I think that's clearly a big reason why the United States and Israel want them out. So they don't have the ability to unilaterally make a decision like that, obviously, but the fact that they're pushing for it is a worrying development. In Syria, Israel is also striking. It's like, all eyes are maybe on Iran and of course on Palestine this week, but like it's really wild the extent to which Israel has really gone off the reservation this week in ways that like are really truly unimaginable. So they also did a series of strikes in Israel, in Syria. They hit a car, claiming that people in that car were affiliated with Hamas, despite no evidence of that being the case. And Israel is now looking for negotiations with Syria to be brokered by, of course, the neutral arbiter, the United States, um, basically with the idea that Israel has presented to the United States a series of red lines on Syria, saying like, here are things that we're totally not okay with the Syrian state ever doing. It includes a series of red lines about Turkey, incidentally, like they don't want any Turkish military bases to operate inside Syria. Um, they want to make sure that like no Iranian or Hezbollah presence is ever allowed inside Syria. They want the Syrian military to not have any access to southern Syria, like these like absurd demands that surely the US will comply with. And so the idea of Israel-Syria negotiations feels like a little bit of a misnomer, but nevertheless, obviously, they're looking for sort of official sanction basically to continue their ongoing occupation and control of southern Syria. And then moving, of course, to the big regional news of the week, which happened last night. So, just trying to stay caught up and on top of all of this. Israel has begun what apparently will be several days worth of strikes on Iran. Really devastating bombardments that have already occurred in multiple waves so far that targeted civilian infrastructure, including a number of apartment buildings. The first confirmed Iranian casualty was a child, unsurprisingly, supposedly aimed at, degrading Iran's nuclear capabilities. They've hit more than 100 targets so far as of this morning, and the expectation is that the attacks are going to continue for the coming at least several days, but it's not super clear, I think, quite how long that'll be and how long this will last. Um, there's a lot to unpack here. Um, and like the US involvement in it is a really key piece. This was the slide that I had prepared yesterday afternoon, before the bombardments, showing that it was likely that an attack might be coming. We already knew as of a couple of days ago that the United States was pulling out all non-essential personnel from Iraq and other places in the Middle East, um, in anticipation of, like an escalating regional conflict. So that obviously means that they were aware that something like this was going to happen. The negotiations on the negotiations between the United States and Iran on this like nuclear, uh, disarmament, which is not really the right phrase there because Iran doesn't have nuclear arms, but seem to be reaching an impasse largely because of the incoherence of the Trump administration on this. Like the big sticking point, as far as I understand it, seemed to be really focused on this idea of uranium enrichment. And the US negotiators were basically laying out a series of possible routes that could take, like limited uranium enrichment or like, reaffirming Iran's right to enrich uranium, but like not like shutting down all current uranium processes, whatever, there's a lot of different options there that had been discussed. And then, like, whenever any progress was made, Trump would say something about, like, oh, Iran can't have access to any enriched uranium and, like, they can't be allowed to do any uranium enrichment. And that would sort of reset everything to square one. So the fact that the negotiators couldn't really take a stand on anything, I think, was a really bad sign, obviously, that these negotiations weren't going to go anywhere. And now, um, faced with, I would say, interestingly, dual crises, right? Obviously, with the mess in Los Angeles and in other places, Trump's plummeting approval ratings, and similarly, and this also didn't get a ton of news, the Israeli Knesset being 2 votes away from is dissolving the government, which was uh, yesterday, well, the day before yesterday, in California time. uh, where the expectation was that the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, was going to dissolve itself and force a new election, that most polls were already showing that Netanyahu would lose by quite a bit. Um, the fact that that vote happened, there was some talk that another vote was about to happen right before these strikes took place, and then everything got canceled. So I think there's a lot to be said about the United States and Israel using this as an opportune moment to, wag the dog, so to speak, but like basically to take attention away from their own domestic catastrophes and sort of refocus everything um, on these strikes on Iran. And it's also, I think, really important to recognize the fact that the U.S. military was not involved in these strikes. That's been reaffirmed multiple times, and that does in fact appear to be true. That obviously does not mean that the U.S. is somehow, innocent or immune from complicity in what happened. They were clearly providing intelligence and other support. They clearly knew about these strikes ahead of time. But it is worth noting that the Israeli military does not itself really, as far as people know, at least, does not have the capability to destroy Iran's nuclear program. Like most of what's happening in terms of Iran's nuclear program is deep, deep, deep underground, and it requires pretty massive armaments, like way beyond even those 2,000-pound bombs that the U.S. continues to supply to Israel to reach that far down. And so part of, I think, why Israel is saying that its strikes are going to take multiple days is that they have to hit the same spot over and over and over again with the hope that they can get down deep enough to actually hit those sites. And it's not super clear whether they can actually do that or not. And so, like, uh, Iran wasn't developing nuclear weapons. They didn't really seem to have any desire to develop nuclear weapons in this moment. This was clearly so obviously just a pretext, and a pretext like for what? It doesn't seem like it's much other than, Israel operating with total unlimited international impunity to basically do whatever it wants at whatever cost it wants. And sure enough, as Thomas mentioned right at the top, we're now seeing Iran missiles striking Tel Aviv literally in the last 30 minutes or so. So this is escalating, right? There's no question that this is escalating. Now we just need to see the extent to which it's going to escalate, right? Like we don't know yet what Iran's response will be. They did say quite clearly that if they were attacked, that um, they would consider all like U.S. military locations across the Middle East to be fair game. So we are seeing what could be a really, really significant escalation here. And whatever equilibrium had existed is obviously thrown out of balance now. And so what happens next is somewhat anyone's guess. And obviously this is all really fresh. I'm not caught up on what has happened this morning. It's been a really busy day. But I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say next week. But for the time being, things are looking a little, obviously, very spicy and deeply, deeply concerning. Moving to the domestic front, some really good news on the Mahmoud Khalil case, where a judge basically said that this nonsense foreign policy rule that Marco Rubio had been using to justify Mahmoud Khalil's deportation can't be used, and that the administration would have to let him go today. Uh, if that was the criteria that they were going to use. And unsurprisingly, what happened, I think just an hour or two ago, was the administration came back and said, well, okay, we'll use other pretexts to continue to hold him. So despite the fact that the court order basically said that he should be released today, that is not in fact going to happen. Um, but it is a significant blow to the U.S. government's narrative around this case. And hopefully it does get us a step closer to Mahmoud Khalid being released. But, we'll see how things develop there. There's so much more the judge could be doing, incidentally. So, the fact that he's making these rulings is something. But, like, yeah, there's a lot more that I wish he would do. And there's a lot to that case that we could get into. Um, in terms of the Freedom Flotilla, I'm sure all the folks saw the interception, the illegal interception and kidnapping of the people aboard the Medellin, several of whom, I think by agreement of the people on the ship, a couple of them left more or less immediately so that they could continue to tell the story, including Greta Thunberg. Others refused to sort of sign whatever documents and that the Israeli military was forcing them to sign, and were being held in detention, including a number of members of the European Parliament, including Rima Hassan and a bunch of other people who had been held basically this entire week. And then again, I would say through popular pressure, through a big public campaign about the illegality of basically kidnapping those people and detaining them and holding them prisoner. Most of them were scheduled to be released um, yesterday. Yesterday, yeah. Although even the ones who were scheduled to be released, three of them have now been brought back because with the shutting down of Israeli airspace as a result of the strike on Iran, even this has sort of been thrown into chaos among everything else. So a bit of a mess there, but still an important development. And, in the vein of the Freedom Flotilla, there's also the Samud convoy, which is getting basically no Western press, despite the fact that literally thousands and thousands of North Africans are in this massive convoy heading towards Rafah, to the southern part of Gaza, going through all of North Africa. The first of them have now started to reach Egypt, and Egypt, unsurprisingly, is arresting and deporting people that it perceives to be trying to head to the Israeli border. So, what it will do when the mass of the convoy actually gets to Gaza is an open question. I think there's a lot to say there about what's going to happen with the Samud convoy, but I would really encourage people to keep their eyes on it, to keep it visible as much as possible, and to make sure that it has like broad international backing so that Egypt can't do terrible things to them under the guise of nobody paying attention. Moving on to some of the local repression that folks have been facing here. We're seeing now the Department of Justice is suing the Jerusalem Coffee House in Oakland over these like really thin pretexts that it's somehow not allowing Jewish folks to go to that coffee house, which is obviously and patently untrue. But even more troublingly, there are new like sanctions and designations from the US government for organizations that are, according to them, funding Hamas and the PFLP. And so, like, this sort of like broader state repression apparatus basically trying to silence Palestine advocacy is reaching really terrifying proportions. Included in the list of organizations this week was Ad-Damir, a really well-known and very well-respected organization that supports Palestinian prisoners. And you can see like how unimaginably thin the evidence and the argument that the government is using to attack organizations like this are. All it says is, like Samidun, which the U.S. also designated last year, they're saying, like Samidun, Ad-Damir has long supported and is affiliated with the PFLP. No evidence, no actual accusations, no material connections, just this vague sentence. And then also just says that a person who is affiliated with Samidun sent money to Ad-Damir, which, like, yeah, it's a nonprofit that people donate to. And the fact that somebody affiliated with another organization that the US government doesn't like donated to Ad-Damir is enough for them to label them as basically a terrorist organization. So really, really horrifying developments here, and like just a unabashed attempt at blatant repression. And speaking of blatant repression, that there's been a lot of legislation that has been coming around, and I'm sorry that I did not include it all this week. But one that I did really want to uplift was this the mess over a bill in Congress to condemn the Boulder attack, which Republicans very cleverly on their part basically turned into legislation that condemned the phrase "Free Palestine" and expressed gratitude to ICE for protecting the homeland. And Democrats, obviously, unwilling to do anything that would jeopardize their like Zionist credentials, voted for this legislation pretty much en masse. And now here we are in a situation where like ICE is occupying and terrorizing all of these communities. And the Democrats who are saying that this is like a really horrible overreach, literally those same people voted to express gratitude to ICE last week. And obviously Republicans are using that to be like, what the hell are you talking about? So just another way in which the sort of Palestine stuff just connects so deeply and so profoundly with the like repression and authoritarian turn that's happening here too. And there's a lot to that specific piece that I really would love to get into, maybe in a future PSA. But just to say, I think the Spencer Ackerman article, the author of Forever Wars, did a great piece in Zateo about how the imperial boomerang has come back like squarely and hitting us in the face. Um, and in terms of what has been happening in Gaza and what the US has been doing in its colonial projects, around the world, we're now facing that same militarized presence, repression, surveillance, and violence here, right? In more or less exactly the same ways. I mean, we're literally seeing members of Congress talking about human shields in reference to like anti-ICE protests now. So it's not surprising that both the language and the tactics have come home as they always do. And this Twitter thread by Noura Harakat, I think does a really wonderful job of talking about how like you don't get to complain about Trump without understanding how that turn is related to like how fascism at home is related to genocide abroad. And I think, it's definitely worth a read and getting into that. And like, I don't know that it's ever been clearer than it is now, right? And seeing in this moment, like I'm really struck by, for example, seeing the footage come out of Los Angeles and seeing these like indigenous communities hurling stones at, giant armored cars, right? And like the ways in which that like security repression like hits back on that with just unmitigated violence, like almost glee in that violence. It's impossible, I think, not to draw those parallels and to understand those struggles as basically being the same thing. Also, absolutely wild this week that Alex Padilla, the senator from California, whom many of us, right, have been like dragged and handcuffed out of his office every time we've tried to stand up to something that, make him stop being so complicit in the genocide. Himself was then handcuffed and dragged out of an office, right, as he tried to do that at the federal level. It just shows, right, that these forces that you will unleash just come back around and devour you as a consequence. So yeah, there's a lot there on the Imperial Boomerang stuff, and one day maybe we'll get into it. But just to sum up, the slaughter in Gaza really continues unabated. It's just horrifying to see this at such a level and at such a scale. And it's important to note that the underlying strategy, I think, that informs that occupation of Gaza is doomed to fail. Like Gideon's chariots will not successfully control Gaza. It does not have the capability to do that. So what's incumbent on us is, making sure that the pressures that are brought to bear on that occupying army are such that the occupation ends as soon as it possibly can. And similarly, I would say, like we're seeing that the pressures that we're putting on making sure that aid makes it into Gaza does work. Like we're seeing real results from that, and that pressure should be amplified. Of course, the big thing this week is just that the attack on Iran has thrown off like the entire regional equilibrium. So we really don't know. We really don't know what next week will bring. It's going to be a scary time, and we need to look out for each other because that a scary time there, as we know, means a scary time here. And here we are, right? Like being hit with that imperial boomerang. So the one thing that I just wanted us to reflect on a little bit on that is like, as folks, I think with like a leftist political orientation, right? Like we don't like I'm often overwhelmed to find myself here. Like I often wish that I could go backwards because things have gotten so much worse now than they were a month ago, and a month ago they were worse than they were a month before that. But like I think our politics demands of us that we understand the moment that we're in now, right? As being a logical or like an extension of the political conditions that came before it, and to respond to the conditions that are here now and the opportunities that arise out of the conditions that appear now, right? Like what is the ways in which the new developments are creating opportunities for us to create the change that we want to see. And so I think that those opportunities have never been clearer. And like, what a moment, right, for the entire US public to wake up to the fascism that has permeated the entire history of this country, right, and is really coming out in its darkest form now. So there's a lot there that I think that we can work on and build on. And what's coming up? Um, Today at 6 p.m. And also I think tomorrow and the next day, you should check the AROC calendar for those details. The events that were supposed to be attended by the two Palestinian activists who were detained and then deported at SFO yesterday, those events are still happening. So I really encourage you to attend those events if you can to show your support. The first of them is today at 6 p.m. in Oakland. I also want to again raise up AROC's Eid in the Park celebration that is happening this Sunday. I will be there, and I would love to see you all there. And if you want to hear about other events, please do check out the AROC calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text updates, including things like the airport mobilization that happened yesterday, please do text PSA to 833-633-0604. It's not just PSA updates, I promise. And if you want more information, you can always check out the Palestine Media Tracker for the articles that inform this analysis. You can go to palmediatracker.com/signup to sign up for a weekly roundup of the articles included. And that'll get us to the end. Thank you all so much.
Samara, thanks so much for all of that, and thanks everyone for sticking with us. Um, I was perusing through a copy of George Jackson's Blood on My Eye yesterday, and my thumb landed on the kind of heading of fascism, and the subtitle, "Its most advanced form is here in America," and so. Quite an imperial boomerang we're facing, and really want to also express gratitude for everyone here who's been showing up for actions on a regular basis and demonstrating courage in the face of this repression. We certainly need it, and I hope you all are able to see, as Samar so eloquently laid out, these close connections between our struggle against authoritarianism and fascism here and the struggle for liberation in Palestine.